Okay, looks like we're recording. And guys, I am super excited to have on the program right now Peter Hsiung. This has been a long time coming. Before I get to Peter's accolades, I just want to introduce him the way his books introduce him, which is really funny. He's got all these testimonials. So, one, a frequent flying hipster, a misguided yippie, entitled, and of course, a criminal. And that was bestowed upon you by Nancy Grace. And I've got to ask you about that Nancy Grace interview because that was
Nancy
hilarious.
Grace.
Yes. But
I think the
Peter
best
Hsiung,
testimonials are often insults. So I like my bio page to have nothing but criticism.
I do too. Well, Peter Hsiung is the author of several books as well. Peter Hsiung was a former member of the Animal Liberation Front. He's put out this compilation of writings right here. And also one of my favorite books of all time, I've got to say, Liberate Stories and Lessons on Animal Liberation Above the Law. That book was so inspiring to me. Anybody in the animal liberation movement, I highly recommend to read. And people outside of it too, because it really inspired me in ways that were beyond the actual subject matter. It's a lot about like conquering fears and things like that, that I drew a lot from that book. So anyway, Peter Hsiung also did time for rescuing mink. That's how he's most famous, as a former member of the ALF for rescuing mink and foxes from fur farms. And so I'm very proud to have you on the program. I've never met Peter before, so this is very exciting for me. Welcome to the program, Peter.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much.
Well, you're someone that I've looked up to for so long now. And part of it, as I said, is about this book. It's very inspiring. Um, but why don't you kind of take me back through your life a little bit? I don't want to make you just rehash the book, but how did all this like animal liberation stuff get started for you? Because it's different from how a lot of people join the animal liberation movement now, I believe.
Sure. So this is the pre-internet age, which is a really defining detail. So I grew up in, I grew up between Silicon Valley in California and then later the suburbs of Seattle. So when I was in high school, I was living in a town called Mercer Island, which is like, it's the strangest suburb on earth because it's an island, but it's in a lake and it's literally 3 minutes from downtown Seattle. So it's basically just a kind of almost like a gated community with a moat around it in a figurative sense. So that was relevant because it gave me access to the city, but I didn't actually live in the city. So I got all the resources of the city in terms of like the culture and everything. So I got involved in the punk rock music scene through just getting on the bus from Mercer Island, going to downtown Seattle, prowling around record stores, going to shows. And I got exposed to animal rights through the punk rock and hardcore music scene. And I actually had met a vegan when we actually had vegan neighbors when this is Seattle for you, but vegan neighbors when I was like 10 or 11 years old, and my parents told us they were weird and all that. But I'd met vegans, but that was my first. I didn't plant any seeds. I just remembered them. But then later I got involved in the punk rock music scene, got educated about the subject, and didn't become vegetarian right away. It took me probably about a year after that seed getting planted where I knew I was going to do it. I just didn't know how to like tell I lived with my dad at the time. My parents got divorced when I was 10. And I was like, I don't know how to tell my dad. It's kind of weird. And there just weren't vegans at the time. Like you would never just randomly meet a vegan. And so I didn't know anyone else who was vegan. So one day I was skimming through the channels on television late at night. And there was a public, I don't even know if they still do this, but there's a public access. They used to have like cable would have like one TV dedicated, what they call public access. And anyone could just rent an hour of TV and do whatever they wanted. It was like required by the FCC. So somebody put on slaughterhouse footage on loop for a full hour. And I was skimming through this and I just caught a glimpse of it. This is before YouTube. And I just caught a glimpse of it. It was like 2 seconds and I was like traumatized. So that was like, all right, this is happening. I'm becoming vegetarian right now. And then within 3 weeks, I'd become fully vegan. So that was 94. So I was a senior in high school. And again, the only evidence I had that vegans even existed was through just my glimpse into, like, I didn't know anyone. So it was just literally bands. Like I knew there were vegans who had vegan hardcore bands and they were out there somewhere, probably mostly in Syracuse, near like some faraway place. And it was so abstract, but I knew that they were right. And so I got involved. So I became vegan, didn't meet another vegan for a full year.
Yeah. So I read your book probably year and a half, 2 years ago. So I'm going to do a lot of this by memory, but I recall, wasn't there a part in your book where you mentioned that you were noticing on stop signs, there were some of those stickers like stop eating animals. Yeah. And you were like, okay, so there's definitely another vegan in town. You finally met this person and you asked them, well, is that you that's putting it up? And he was like, maybe it was me, maybe it wasn't me.
Yeah, that's exactly how it went. Yeah, yeah. Shout out to him, because I wouldn't have been involved if it wasn't for him. So when I became vegan
Oh,
in high
wow.
school, and other people in my high school found out I was vegan, they were like, "Oh, you must know this guy Dave." And what was so funny is my high school was only 1,200 people, and so my class was only like 300 people, which is enough that you can know everybody. But somehow, never had a class with this mystery Dave. Never, I kind of knew what he looked like, but like never passed him in the hallways, never, nothing. And people just go, "You must know Dave if you're vegan," because it was such a bizarre thing in, you know, 94. And I didn't. And so fast forward to when I became vegan, or fast forward, you know, a bunch of months, I was seeing these stop. So, you know, they still make them, but like the eating animals, you put on the stop sign, right? The sticker. So it says
Yeah.
stop eating animals. So I would see these all over Mercer Island. And I was like, I bet it's that mystery guy, Dave. And then it was New Year's Eve of 95. So literally like the first hour of 1995, it's like after midnight. And me and my friend are skateboarding around Seattle, and I run into this guy, Dave. And I was like, "Hey, man." And I was so excited because I was like, another vegan. I was like, "Hey, man, are you the guy that puts the stickers up?" And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe. I don't know. You know, he's like, he's doing like the security culture thing. And I was like, "Oh, I guess I'm not supposed to ask this." He's like, "Well, if you're interested in this, in this subject, like come to this group I'm involved with at University of Washington. Anyone can come, called Students for Animal Liberation. Show up. And if you're really serious about this, you'll get involved that way."
Oh, interesting.
And so I
Okay.
did. And that was it.
I didn't know Dave was that influential to you. That's pretty cool. That's a cool story. And that's funny to me also how he was doing the security culture thing, and yet at the so it was you who pieced together that was probably Dave putting up the things. But he must have been an outspoken vegan. Everybody knew him as this vegan guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, right. Well, that's a cool story. And you got caught doing that yourself, didn't you? Is that one part of your book?
Yeah, sort of. So not that, but later, and Dave also figures heavily into this part of the story. So we went on, and we're skipping ahead quite a bit, probably a full year or more, but I was engaged in a pretty prolific vandalism campaign, I guess we'll call it, of, you know, we would go to meat distributors and smash out the windows, and we were out very, very consistently. There's a lot of things that we were doing at that time. They were small scale, but still enough to get police attention. So the police were staking out Dave's house. They could never figure out where I lived, because I lived in an abandoned house. I was like legally homeless, I guess you could say. So they staked out Dave's house, thinking that either I would show up there or Dave was responsible. And so they were actually surveilling Dave's house, and they see me come out of his house one night, and I tagged a stop sign with a Magnum marker. So it wasn't a sticker. It was like, and so they were sitting back in the cop car, like, "Well, we can't get him for the serious stuff, but we got him for this." And so I got hauled into court for that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm going to piggyback a little bit on, to use a bad word, I guess, the Green Scare Pod, you had done an interview with, and you were talking about, I really like this part of the interview. So not just to retread, but you were talking about how a lot of the people who got started, you know, doing things like raiding mink farms and things like that were people who previously to that were people who were like engaged in like random acts of mischief and breaking the law, and were very comfortable with being outside the law to some extent. And I think that's interesting. You guys had that discussion about how we've sort of lost that. And I agree, because we do live in a very timid age. And a lot of times people are nervous to do even things that are just like very, very innocuous forms of activism now. And I think, we've sort of almost lost that punk rock culture that you're talking about. A lot of the people that I know who are like former members of the ALF like do have that kind of punk rock background. So it's pretty interesting. I feel like we've lost that. I wonder this. You know, I've talked to John Curtin over at Camp Beagle, and he sort of gave this criticism of like, you know, when we talk about people like you or John, we often say like, what a legend, you know, what a hero. And he pushes back on that and says, you know, like, look, that was just what we did. You know, we weren't heroes back then. He was talking about Barry Horn and Jill Phipps, like saying they would laugh at that. They weren't heroes. That was just what we did. But on the flip side of that, I feel like we don't lionize that enough to where I feel like the animal liberation has this kind of interesting, cool image that we've lost. And I think more people would be attracted to if they knew that history, because I didn't learn about a lot of this history until someone loaned me your book several years ago, 5 years into animal activism. What do you think about that?
I'm kind of of two minds about that, because I do remember, so I'm mostly on the side of what John said, but the other side would be that when I got involved in the hardcore music scene, there were bands like, there's a band called Raid, Earth Crisis, Vegan Reich. You had these hardcore bands that were putting this message out there. And in my mind, I thought these people, I just took it for granted these people were out raiding labs in the middle of the night and then go in the recording studio and record music. You know, I took it for granted these people were like the actual like forefront of the animal liberation movement, and they were actually living their words. And if in that, believing that existed, that there was like this these like warriors that were out crusading for animals on a nightly basis, just believing that was the case motivated me a lot. It gave me something to aspire to. And it gave me a sense of hope that, like, oh wow, like there's actually selfless people out there that are willing to, so I come to since realize the people in the bands are very rarely credible individuals. They're usually come and go within 2 years. But I'm glad I didn't know that back then. And so I'm glad I believed that these people were actually the ALF. Right. And so there is something to be said for, I guess, having kind of an idealized notion of certain individuals, because it gives you something to strive for. But John's absolutely right. Not only is it just what we did, it's, if you understood, if you could see the blooper reel, I think you wouldn't be, right. you wouldn't be holding people up to such a pedestal. I mean, there's so much learning as you go, and there's so many blunders. There's so many things you back out of. There's all the plans that didn't get executed. There's all of the, there's all this stuff that happens that I think really would deflate in the eyes of most people. They could see it deflate the image of like the idealized notion that people have of the ALF. So, and not only that, it's the gap between whoever's watching this, and the ALF is that wide. It's just literally making a decision. There's no like training involved. There's no, vetting process. Like, you just literally just go do it. So the difference could often just be 10 feet. It's like, how far away is your car? If it's in the driveway, it's just getting your car and driving out and doing something. That's right. It. So,
yeah. He argued that it was sort of disempowering. Like, if everybody who rescues animals is a hero, then if somebody feels like, oh, I don't know, am I a hero? Then they feel like, I guess they can't do it. It feels too far. So I appreciate guys like you who sort of make it much more something that anybody could do. Just you explain it as, like you just did, like 10 feet away, like especially if there's something near you, then it really is just as simple as making the decision to go do it. I also appreciate how you sort of talked about prison and sort of demystified prison and jail a lot. Now, I have never spent time in prison, so it's not somewhere I want to go, but you do a good job, I think, in your book of making it seem like, if you do get caught, well, it is just something you go through and you kind of deal with. So yeah, maybe we should just skip ahead to prison then and talk a little bit about that. I'm just curious. Like, I'll tell you, it was Jerry who loaned me your book, and I was talking to Jerry at one point. I was saying, Peter wrote, I think this was in your book, as one part of your book, like, prison is a lot like, at some points of it, just going outside, seeing a bunch of dudes in slippers, like watching professional wrestling. And he said, actually, that sounds really bad. He said that sounded awful. But go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that the point I was trying to make there is that we're fed this idea about what prison is largely through carefully edited TV shows like Lockup or what, they go in these maximum security prisons, they splice together a bunch of riot footage, and then that's what people's impression of what prison is. And while those things do happen, the day-to-day reality is just like I described. It's a bunch of guys in sweatpants drinking coffee, watching Headbangers Ball on MTV. And that's literally what, that's the day-to-day reality of prison. And there are lots of different prisons out there, but that's my experience. And, you mentioned that part of the book. That part was really, really important to me, because my intention with that book was to basically distill down everything that I needed to hear when I was 18 to have become a super warrior. Like, what held me back? And I wanted to hit all those beats. I wanted to go down that checklist of like, what did I need to hear if I had heard this, gotten access to this information, or I had heard this perspective, or whatever the case may be, I potentially could have been 10 times more effective, thought 10 times bigger, done 10 times more. Like, what are those things? And one of the big things that held me back was I just didn't have a well-rounded take on what prison was like. I didn't know, because this is before the internet, this is before you had access to anything. So I just had these like political prisoner biographies from like the 70s, where it just sounded like a fate worse than death. And I didn't really have any access to, like, I hadn't actually met anyone that went to the type of prison I would go to, probably not a max, and who could tell me the actual sober reality, what prison was like. So because I didn't have access to the information, not only when I was getting started, but when I was a fugitive, all the way up till I went to prison, I never had access to the information. So I really wanted there to be a resource that didn't, I didn't want to sugarcoat it, but I didn't want to exaggerate the realities of prison either. I just wanted to have a sober take of what prison was like, so that activists could have access to that information and make their own decision. And that chapter was really, really important to me, because it's very tempting for people. I mean, you look at what sells books, right? If you got an editor at a big publisher and you like, hey, we want you to write a prison biography. Okay, cool. Well, you can't just have 300 pages of someone drinking coffee and watching pro wrestling. You got to have, they need the drama, right? They need the sauce. So that's what's going to sell books. That's what's going to sell movies. That's what's going to get clicks on the internet, or TV shows, or whatever. And so I really wanted something that was, more well-rounded, and just kind of didn't hold back on the bad stuff, but gave just a more realistic perspective on prison.
Well, it's interesting that you say this book could have, made you 10 times more effective or so, because you were really effective. You saved so many animals. I think back to like, every now and then some group will put out a chart, right? Like PETA or somebody will put out a chart like, here's how many animals you might save by going vegan. Of course, we don't know how scientific these things are, but they range from like 100 animals to 300. I don't know how accurate these things are, but at least according to Wikipedia, and I don't know how accurate that is, you save like 8,000 mink or foxes over a stretch of a very short period of time, which is incredible. I mean, like, it's almost like whatever happened, like if I had that experience where I've saved that many lives, almost the rest of my life wouldn't even matter, because I knew like I had done like this amazing thing for all these animals. Like, I mean, I understand like they're not all saved, but I just think that's a really cool thing to hang your hat on. So that's amazing. And like you said, you kind of did it in this time period when you didn't have all this information at your fingertips, and you kind of had to be more of a do-it-yourself kind of person, I guess. What was the information that you had? So you mentioned Dave. You said, you kind of met up with other activists. I'm sure back in those days, you had the zines and things like that you could read. But what were some of those things that got you more into like, not only am I going to be an activist, I'm going to go to raid fur farms?
So there was a lot. There's a few things. So a big one was zines that were coming out. So the self-published, publications. People go to the FedEx office. It was called Kinko's back then, and they would run off. They'd steal photocopies and then circulate these to people just through the mail. It was just it was incredible. It was as effective as it was. But so I get my hands on these zines, and they would often have, a page or two of how-to information, how to carry out various illegal crimes, whether it was like how to get free phone calls, to how to, pick locks or whatever. And so we had access to these zines that you'd order through larger punk rock publications, like Maximum Rock and Roll was a big one. So you get access that way. We also had the animal rights publication. So there was one called Underground. There was another one called The Militant Vegan. There was another one called, a little bit later, called No Compromise. And so these were specific to the animal rights movement. So you get little how-to snippets here and there. But what was interesting was when you're in a time and an age where you're not saturated with information, where you don't have information coming at you, don't have this paradox of choice of like, I could do this. You just get a couple of gems, and you have to build an entire activist career out of it, or identity out of it, or whatever the case may be. You just have a little, you get like one, Underground, the magazine would come out quarterly, and it was 60 pages. And so for the next 3 months, that was all you had. And you had to just study every word. And so it was that same way with other things. So we would, what little information we had, we got a lot more mileage out of than now. I mean, now you have access to an unlimited amount of information on the YouTube. No one does anything with it. It's the craziest thing. And so because every information, every like little bit of data you had carried so much weight. You sort of had this burden of doing something with it. So yeah, we would have underground. We would have, but the big one for me, I've told this story a million times, but I want to give. I don't know who this person was. But they changed everything. Where I was I had taken a Greyhound bus out to Minneapolis in this would have been like early summer, late spring of 1996. And I hooked up with other activists there, and I got taken to a meeting, and someone at the meeting was going on handing out this new publication that just dropped called The Final Nail. And The Final Nail was a list of fur farm addresses and a how-to guide on how to raid fur farms. And this is how information was distributed. It would, a master copy would get mailed to every animal rights group, and then they would go down to the copy store, run off copies, and they would just physically hand them out to people. So so someone just shoved this thing in my face, and I'm just like, it's over. Like, it's on. Like, I have everything I need. I have the where and the how. So it's game on at this point. So that was The Final Nail publication, was huge. And I later reprinted most of it in that book you held up, The ALF Strikes Again, that I published. And so that was a big one for me, The Final Nail.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like, it sounded like it was so much harder to do back then. You mentioned how this was like before the internet age. Nowadays, like, it's much easier for us to get that kind of information. Do you think that makes us kind of complacent? Because, it wasn't until like a week ago, and the timing of this interview, I'd been wanting to talk to you for a long time. Now, we did learn that there was this mink farm raid just about a week ago. And so I had seen you on the ALF Animal Activism Collective page doing your live stream. So it is timely. But I remember, like, just shortly before this mink farm raid, I was opining with my friends, like, how come you don't see this more often? The information is out there. There's a website. It's got all the details. So, and I didn't really have an answer for that. I don't think my friend had an answer for that, but I wonder if it is just this complacency. Like, everything is just too easy for us to get. Like, it doesn't seem like we're as much a group of people who do things so much as, like, talk about doing things.
Yeah, that's a huge, I mean, I could really truly speak about this for an hour. I think one thing that doesn't come up enough is this concept. It's called narcotizing dysfunction, where people, when talking about something, activates the same part of your brain as actually doing the thing. And so prior to the internet, you did not have a way, you didn't have an outlet. There was no social media. There was no internet. You didn't, you couldn't just like publish a book. Like, there was no way to actually, and you couldn't just run around talking to random strangers on the street about what you want to do, because you just sound insane. So you had to actually do the thing to satisfy that part of your brain that needs to act. And now we've got the internet. So everyone is the keyboard gangster. Everyone is talking about what they think and what they want to do and what they're going to do on the internet. And I think consequently we're doing less of it, because we just don't have that we have that pressure release now in the form of the internet. So I think that's a big part of it. I think there's also what I referenced earlier, the paradox of choice, where now the internet gives us so many options. We have that analysis paralysis where we freeze up and we don't know which path to take, because the next option is always just a click away. So it's like, that sounds cool, but what about this? What about this? What about this? And then you've got a million people voicing their opinions about what the best form of activism is, and nobody knows. Whereas before, you might have been wrong in what path you chose, but you only had a couple options, because and so you just had to pick one and go with it. And like I said, you might have been wrong, but whatever you did with conviction, because you hadn't been exposed to 100,000 different opinions by the age of 10 years old or something. So back then it was just like, all right, you had underground and the magazine, and they're saying this is the path, and then maybe you've got PETA saying this is the path, and you got to choose. And there you go. There's your options. And I like that it's kind of addition by subtraction, because when you don't have a million avenues to take, your direction has to get focused this way or this way, and instead of just countless different ways. So the energy is just less diffused. So I think that's a big part of it too.
What I've also appreciated about your writing, and I don't know if your thinking has evolved on this or not, but you never downplay other forms of activism. In fact, you were talking about how, like, you know, early on in your activism, like you might be out there handing out flyers during the day and then going to do the first stuff later in the evening. So yeah, and so I've said that one of the best things that I took from your book was just this overcoming fear. You also talked about it on the Green Scare Pod, which I appreciate, is just like learn on the job, so to speak. I have taken that to heart, and like I spent like a year when I went vegan of like intentionally putting myself in different uncomfortable situations, like different forms of activism that I would feel uncomfortable about. I was also like playing piano at the time, and I remember I was playing piano on the street. I remember taking lessons because I felt like I had hit a roadblock. I quickly discovered like lessons weren't for me, because one of the things that my teacher at the time said was, "Oh, you're not ready really to play." And I was like, "Hell yeah, I'm ready to play." Like I will go out on the street and play and mess up. And that's part of what, like, it's like exactly what you're talking about. You know, you can spend forever like trying to learn how to do something, but until you go and do it, you're really not learning. Like, which is ironic because you've written these books that are great resources. And it's funny because some of the message in your book is like almost like put down the books, go out and do it. which is great. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, learning by doing is a huge one, and that's kind of gotten lost in the, we call the information age. But just the one thing I always say is like, just, you don't need a plan, you don't need a guaranteed outcome. Just go somewhere where you want something to happen, and just with a blank mind, just say a Target, just go to a factory farm, go to a slaughterhouse, just go there, and then opportunities will present themselves. It doesn't even mean you have the agenda of breaking the law. It just means nothing happens until you get out of your house. Or as I like to say, nothing happens until you start trespassing. And that's when the dominoes start to fall and like momentum starts to happen. But it's never going to happen in your head, and it's never going to happen on your computer. You have to just get outside the house. And it's almost like the closest thing I have to a religion or a belief in something, like where there's almost like the universe has a deal with you, where if you just put yourself out there, the universe will meet you halfway. It's bizarre how many times I've seen this play out, where you have no plan, you'll have no expectation of any positive outcome, but you'll just go, so like back in the day, like, I mean, I would go to, there's a million examples of this, but like there was a slaughterhouse right outside downtown Seattle. So we would just like go there, and it's like, what am I going to do at a slaughterhouse? What it's in the almost in the middle of downtown in Seattle. Like, what am I going to do at the slaughterhouse? I didn't have any expectation. I wasn't even thinking about the ALF activity at that point. I just was compelled to get out of the house, and answers will come to me. And then sure enough, you put your face to the gate. You're like, oh, what is that staircase? Oh, that's a staircase coming down from the roof. Interesting. Well, how can I get on the roof? You go around back, and all this other stuff dots start to connect. And you start to realize, oh, I can actually get inside the slaughterhouse. Well, now what do? I don't know. We end up going back to that slaughterhouse and breaking into it through the roof with no expectation of what we're going to do. And we end up finding several chickens in there and rescuing them. And it's just kind of stuff that happens when you just get out of the house and start and let opportunities present themselves.
Yeah. Was there a moment for you where you sort of crossed over this sort of threshold of, like, you discuss a lot in your book, the concept of fear and how the fear basically lives in your head. You have this, concept of there's the cop in your head, right? I'm basically asking, was there a moment for you where you had this fear of like, okay, am I going to do this? And in terms of like raiding a fur farm, where you did have to confront this fear, did you have this kind of trepidation that I think a lot of people would have of like, okay, first I'm this person, now I'm this person who's like underground ALF activist? It's probably a moment of fear. Was it for you?
I don't think that was a hard transition for me. And I think this is the case of a lot of us. And we touched on this earlier, which is we were all essentially outlaws going into this. I mean, in the sense that, I came steeped in 60s counterculture literature. I'd read books about Abby Hoffman and various people that aren't really talked about that much anymore. But I had this sort of outlaw mindset going into it. I lived in my family doesn't have money, but we did live in a wealthy suburb, and I essentially did use this suburb as my playground. And I was shoplifting. I was stress testing the limits of my fear on a daily basis for years going into activism. So it wasn't a big leap for me because I was already put myself in this in situations so many times where I was exposing myself to some amount of risk. Now that could just be something like I said, it could be shoplifting, it could be skateboarding somewhere you're not supposed to skateboard. By the time I got involved in activism, I had identified an abandoned house on Mercer Island in this very wealthy neighborhood that was owned by the Department of Transportation. And so I moved into this house and I was living in an entirely illegal existence just by living in this house. The house was not my house. I was not allowed to be there. I would have been arrested if I'd been caught there. And I took over the basement of this house and lived there for a couple of years. And so everything I was doing was sort of in some form or another outlaw at that point. So that helped, but I think that does help if you're constantly putting yourself in situations that have some uncertain, it doesn't necessarily have to be extreme legal consequences, but some, uncertain outcomes, putting yourself in a situation where the outcome is uncertain over and over and over again to build up that muscle, that risk tolerance. So that was a big part of it. But I wouldn't say there was a defining moment where it was like, all right, I'm going underground for animals, because first of all, that's a false binary. And we touched on this earlier as well, which is you can be protesting during the day and going out raiding farms at night. There's no reason you can't do both. There might be some security risk, but most people, if you actually look at who's been caught for these actions, most of those people were involved in legal protests in the day and they were going out at night, and that's the same person. So you don't have to make a decision, is my point. But I think, from the first meeting I went to at the University of Washington, that guy Dave who invited me, the very first meeting, there was the underground publication. It was issue number, I think, 3. And so I picked it, I bought it. It was like $2. And I was getting introduced to the concept of ALF from day one. And so I want to shout out, there was a woman named Allison Frost who founded that organization. And then, who I don't know what happened to her. And then another woman named Allison Porter who founded the organization, who later married my co-defendant who snitched on me. So we don't like her, but she did co-found this group. So that was the culture that I was stepping into from day one.
Yeah, interesting. So you had to kind of cut your teeth on those things. So is there a moment that you can identify earlier than that where you felt like you sort of crossed over, or is it was just sort of your lifestyle at that point?
If we're talking about crossing over into carrying out illegal actions for animals, I do have a memory. I would do anything for this footage. This sounds insane, but MTV, back when they played music videos, they'd have this show called MTV News. And MTV News, this had to be I had to be 14 or 15, well before I was vegan. They had a segment, I don't know what the context was, on the ALF. And I specifically remember footage from UC Riverside. There was a laboratory was broken into in 1985 where Britches the monkey was liberated. It's kind of a famous. So they showed footage of these activists, these huge, I don't know, they look like guys, I don't know, but crowbarring open this door, storming this lab. And I specifically remember thinking, if I ever get money, I want to give every penny I have to this organization, which I didn't know at the time you can't donate to the ALF, but that was my thought. And that planted a seed way back. And so there was something in me that said, this is the path, and this is before, again, I was vegetarian, vegan, or anything. So there was definitely some things that happened along the way, but it wasn't really until I showed up that first meeting, I got the underground, I'm reading about direct action carried out around the world. And I remember thinking, and then while I'm reading about this at this meeting, we're talking about planning to protest. And so there's a stark juxtaposition where I'm thinking, protest or just break down the door and rescue the animals? I know which one makes the most sense to me.
You talked about this blooper reel, right? If people could see the blooper reel, I'm wondering if you're able to talk about it. Can you put me in some of those early fur farms that you started with, and just kind of paint a picture for people? Because I think, for one, it's pretty interesting and exciting, but it might be interesting for people to know what some of those first 1 or 2 times that you went out were like, if you're able to talk about them.
Yeah, of course. So the first farm I went to was a farm that I believe recently was found to be closed. It was in Granite Falls, Washington, and it was called, God, it's crazy, I can't remember the guy's name, but anyway, so it was this farm that we just drove out to, and we parked across the street, and it was the middle of the day. So we were just apparently fearless or naive, one of the two, which is those things are often appear to, have look the same. And so we're in the middle of the day and we're just like walking up and down the sheds going, oh, wow, there's mink. We could just open the cages. We didn't do it at that point, but I was with my future co-defendant and in my legal case later. And so we're walking up down the rows, like there's 10,000 animals here. And so we went back to his car and this car comes screeching up behind us. And the car, it was one of those, like, it must be some kind of rural thing, but they had like a, what do you call it? Like a loudspeaker mounted. It was almost like a Dukes of Hazzard style, like a loudspeaker mounted on the top of the car. And we heard the guy say, we literally heard the guy say ALF. I couldn't make out anything else, but we heard him say ALF. So like he was already, I think he was saying like, get out of here, ALF or something. And so we were already like marked. So we couldn't use that car anymore because they got our license plate. And then we went back to that same farm later and we tripped alarms, which is very rare for farms to have alarms, at least as of, I haven't checked in the last 5 years or so, but so we tripped off alarms later. So we were constantly going back to this farm and like having these like mishaps like 2 or 3 times. We got chased from that farm later by the same farmer with a shovel. And but just to paint a picture for the person people that don't know what a farm looks like, it's just, these are not enclosed. I mean, they're fenced off sheds, but they're not enclosed most of the time. Sometimes they are, but very rarely. And they're just essentially these outdoor sheds with a fence around them. The fence can be very fortified, but if you can get over the fence or get through the fence, it's just a bunch of sheds and cages. And that's essentially it. So later we went to a farm that was also nearby, maybe a mile or 2 away, also in Granite Falls, Washington, went to one in Snohomish. We would go to all the farms in the area and just pick the easiest ones.
So when you say it's rare for a fur farm to have alarms and stuff, how are you tripping the alarms? Like, what was it that was tripping the alarm?
There were photoelectric sensors. So they were essentially these boxes on posts in the corners of the farm. And there was invisible beams that connect each box. And so when you break the beam, it would trip the alarm. And so we didn't know at the time, we thought that was normal. In years after that, I would proceed to go to probably almost 200 farms around the country. And I almost never saw that again. So it's really unique to the farms in the Northwest. So we really started out in the hardest possible part of the country to raid farms. And so what we found out is that you could actually just roll under the beam. And then you just cut the fence, roll under the beam, step up on the other side, and you'd have free access to the farm. And so we figured it out very quickly. And the way we figured that out was just simply by doing it. I mean, we went to a farm one time and we cut the fence. And so it's like go time. There's no turning back. Once you cut the fence, it's, they know you were there. So it's go time. And we rolled under the beam, rolled back, and then just retreated and waited for 45 minutes. And when the cops didn't show up, we just went for it. And so there's like, 5 of us rolling under these beams. It was actually, looking back, fairly bold. I think even waiting 45 minutes was fairly bold. I think we probably should have waited 90 or so in the country.
Oh, yeah.
But we just went for it and it worked.
Well, do you think that's because there was such a history of ALF activity and environmental activist activity in the Pacific Northwest? Is that why?
I think so. I think Rod Coronado's campaign, Operation Bite Back, had targeted the fur breeders co-op in the Northwest and then some farms in Oregon as well, experimental fur farm in Oregon, and then actually a mink farm in Oregon as well, all of which had fires set. So I do think that probably was why the Northwest was particularly fortified. It's usually handled by the feed cooperatives tend to sort of manage the farms on their route and like give direction and recommendations. So I think probably the Northwest Fur Breeders Co-op, once it got burned down by Rod Coronado in 92, probably decided, okay, everyone that we service, we need to make sure they all have alarms. And so I would say the majority of farms in Washington at the time were alarmed. Not all of them, but the majority of the ones that I saw. And also there were quite a few in Oregon as well.
You mentioned your co-defendant snitching on you. And I assume back in the day, you were probably going to these farms with someone who you believed, this is a solid person. This is why I trust them to do this action with them. What does that tell you? Because were there signs that he might be that kind of person who would kind of fold under pressure and I assume that's what happened, that, the pressure got to him and he decided to, try to save himself. Is that what happened? And, what does that tell you about, say you're trying to do activism with people and choosing the right person that you want to do it with, or does it mean do it yourself? Don't involve anybody?
My opinion on this has changed quite a bit. And I like to think it's not shaped, hopefully not shaped too much by the fact that I was snitched on. And I think it's just more of a realistic take now. But at the time, I believe that we were all signing on to the same contract, which is we're willing to go to prison for this. We're willing to die for this if need be. And we will never break that sacred vow to inform on each other or anything. And I really believed that everyone was on board with the same contract. And this is how naive I was. When I became a fugitive, I didn't have it just happened abruptly. So I didn't have any time to like seek legal counsel or anything. And so I had one of my above ground contacts set me up with an attorney visit. And so I showed up at this attorney's office. I'm like literally on the run. Like I'm literally hitchhiking at this point. Like I am a fugitive. And so I showed up at this attorney's office, and he very generously donated his time, and he's walking me through, my charges and let me know what to expect, etc. And he said, okay, now we need to talk about what happens if your co-defendant informs on you. And I literally cut him off, and I was like, not going to happen. And he said, well, okay, I understand, we don't think it's going to happen, but historically most people do inform. So we need to actually address this possibility. And I literally was like, will not happen. Next subject. And I wouldn't even let him entertain the thought. But I believe so strongly it was just out of the question. And I remember where I was when I found out that. So this is going fast forward in 2000. So I was the crimes happened in 97, charged in 98. In 2000 is when my co-defendant was arrested and became an informant. And I was with my girlfriend at the time, who got news of this like before it became public. And I remember she's like on the payphone talking to somebody, hangs up the payphone. She's like, hey, I don't know how to tell you this, but like your co-defendant's state's evidence now. And I was just, I couldn't process it. I literally didn't believe it was possible. So to answer your question, I believe now, and I hate to pollute the minds of people younger and less cynical than me, but I believe that anyone is capable of snitching. I don't think you should trust anyone. You should work alone whenever possible. I think, you should never put 20 or 30 years of your life in the hands of anybody else, period. And I think most ALF activity, when you actually analyze it closely, there is a way to do it with one person. You're not going to be able to ever carry out large liberations, lab raids, etc., with one person. That will require large groups of people, but fortunately, you will probably never get, 15 or 20 years for that type of action, just a burglary type action. But if you're talking about arson, just do it alone. That would be my advice. It's not worth it. And the people that you think are solid and they're fortified and they're never going to break, that might even be true in that moment, but you don't know what's going to happen to someone 5 or 10 years down the road. And some of these crimes have no statute of limitations, or there can be loopholes, and people have kids, their priorities change, like things happen. So that's my take on it now.
When you say you thought we were all part of this whole contract, did y'all ever discuss possibilities of things like that, or did you just kind of leapfrog over that? And I wonder
that's
if you
interesting.
do you think that that's something that people should do? Like if they work as a team, should they be discussing that sort of thing?
You should be discussing it, but there's something that you believe so deeply, it doesn't need to be discussed. Like I have a friend who identifies as an anarchist. I don't identify as an anarchist, but she got married, and she was telling me, I was like, is your husband an anarchist too? And she says, I don't know, but it's something that's so ingrained in me that like it doesn't have to be spoken. Or she didn't say I don't know. She said definitely, but we've never talked about it. Sorry, that's what she said. And it's almost like, did we ever have a conversation about what would happen if we were caught and how we shouldn't snitch? I don't know, because that was just implicit. I don't remember those conversations, but I don't remember ever thinking informing would ever need to be something we ever brought up. It was just part of the culture. You just don't do. I mean, and again, that transcends activism. It's like you don't tattletale on kids, when you're in kindergarten. Like that's just that only bad people do that. So I don't remember those conversations specifically. I do remember conversations about how much time do we think this will get, and this is us being like amateur, lawyers. We had no business assessing what the possible legal outcome would be. But I remember someone saying definitively, if you raid a mink farm, you get 2 years, which is so funny because I ended up getting 2 years. But like,
that's right.
That's only like because I got really lucky. And so like, but I remember this person was like, no, I read somewhere you get 2 years. Like, okay, 2 years. So that's it. And we had no business, you know, again, having strong opinions about things we didn't know anything about, but.
Yeah. You know, I realize I've sort of structured this interview so poorly because I'm asking you questions like almost assuming like people know the story. So why don't we like kind of back up and just explain to people we're talking about Justin, you know, we're talking about you doing some prison time, but people don't know what the story is. So I guess like in just in a skeletal way, because I really do want people to just read the stuff, read the books and that sort of thing. But like what ended up happening and why you got sent to prison for 2 years and spent 7 years on the run, which is one of the most fascinating parts of your story, which I think is, you know, different for a lot of people. Like a lot of people get caught, go right to prison or something, but you spent 7 years on the run. So yeah, give people a little bit of the background.
Yeah, I'll talk about what I went to prison for, and then we can talk about the fugitive thing, which I think is very different than I think what people would expect. So leading up to the crimes that got me sent to prison, we were out pretty consistently. You know, if we weren't looking at targets on a weekly basis, we were out actually committing crimes on a weekly basis. And so at the time, I can say we weren't thinking big enough. Like we were thinking very small scale. So you just look at your immediate environment and you go, what are the targets that we could sabotage? We don't really have resources in terms of having, I mean, a lot of us didn't have cars, but like we don't know people can home animals because we all agree we want to be rescuing animals. When we rescued those chickens from the slaughterhouse, the story I referenced earlier, like we literally didn't know where they were going to go. We went back to my apartment and just said, okay, now what do we do? We have these chickens. Like, we don't know where to take them. And which it ties into a bigger lesson I learned, which is it's okay to do something without having every aspect of it planned out in advance, because when you put yourself in a situation where you have no choice but to come up with a solution, you will. But anyway, but in any case, so we were going to meet distributors and we would break out the windows of the trucks. The idea being, well, if they can't distribute the meat, maybe that will somehow translate to saved animals. They have to order less meat because they can deliver for a day. And like, you know, that was kind of the logic. Looking back now, I can say that it was well-intentioned and it was, I'm glad we did something based on the information we had at the time, but I wish we'd been thinking bigger. But so we would go all over Seattle, just breaking out windows everywhere. Again, started at fast food restaurants. Then we're like, okay, well, this is going to be possibly not very effective. Let's go to distributors. And then we started looking at slaughterhouses. We went to a pig slaughterhouse. We broke into the slaughterhouse. We stole all the equipment used to kill the animals. And so on the idea, maybe there would be like one day where they couldn't kill animals, or we're doing what we could without really knowing what the impact was going to be, which I think is good. I think you shouldn't always necessarily be able to quantify the impact of your actions. You just take an action, you hope for the best. So we were doing all these things. And then I referenced earlier how I was living in an abandoned house that was owned by the Department of Transportation. So this would be like the later 97, where there was a whole bunch of us living in this house, and we were all activists to one degree or another. I was living with the guy, Dave, I mentioned. I was living with my future co-defendant, with his girlfriend who founded the animal rights group. There's just a whole bunch of us living in this house. And the police caught us one night. So they arrested all of us, and they found a bunch of literature in the house that was ALF literature. And so they began to piece together, okay, we probably think these are the people responsible for all of this vandalism happening all over Seattle. And so we realized at that point we were very marked. And I was already marked, and I think Dave was marked, but everyone else wasn't. But now we were all marked. And so we made the assessment at that point that if we were going to keep staying active, we needed to take it outside of Seattle. So we bought a car for like $800, red Geo Metro, and we decided we were going to go raid fur farms across the country. And we had some experience with that up to that point in the Northwest, but we wanted to take the show on the road. So we got the final nail. We had all the addresses, and we didn't even really have a course mapped out. We were just like, let's just get east of Seattle. And we wanted to hit farms so that didn't look like they couldn't just trace and go, it's very clear they came from Seattle. So I think we kind of decided, well, if we start in eastern Idaho, maybe they will think we came from Eugene, Oregon, or like Southern California. Maybe we get far enough away that, you know, it's not obvious we came from Seattle. So the night I don't want to say the night, within a 2 or 3 day range of when we were supposed to hit our first fur farm, we're going to go to Preston, Idaho, which is Preston and Franklin are these two towns in southeastern Idaho that have a lot of fur farms. At the time, there was like 20 farms between those two towns. And we got ID'd in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. We got stopped. It was this whole, I won't go into the whole story, but we were suspected of burglarizing a convenience store, which did not happen, but we slept on the roof of it while it got burglarized overnight. So when we crawled off the roof, we got stopped by the police who thought we burglarized it. And so we got ID'd. So now that places us in Idaho. So we decided to eliminate Idaho from being our first stop and go further east into Montana, et cetera. And it turns out within a 2 or 3 day range of when we were supposed to go, possibly the night of, we were supposed to go to a farm in Preston, Idaho. That farm got raided by people that were not us. Yeah. So it was this wild coincidence. So anyway, we get all the way to South Dakota, and we hit our first farm in Watertown, South Dakota. We released, I think it was 2,500, 3,000 mink from there. And then we went to Sioux City, Iowa. We released what the official number was 5,000. I know for a fact it was 10,000 or more. I don't know why they would downplay the number, but it was 10,000 mink, 1,000 or 100 foxes. And we proceeded all the way through Wisconsin. We hit 4 more farms. And this is all within a 2-week period. And then we get to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, which is the home of the largest fur farm in the country. And we thought we were driving around the perimeter, and it turns out the driveway looked like a road that went around the perimeter. It was actually the driveway of the farmer's house. So we drive, unbeknownst to us, we drove up the driveway. We just ran right into one of the farmers in her driveway, and immediately did a U-turn. And she gets in her car and starts following us. And she had what the time had to be one of the only cell phones in the country. This is 97. And we didn't even realize she was following us. And she was on her cell phone calling the police saying, I think I found the people that are responsible for this whole wave of mink releases around the country. And we had been spotted all over the Midwest. I mean, it was like, it became a joke to us. Like we would drive by a farm. There'd be a farmer waiting in his driveway. The farmer would chase us. We would get away. And we just thought it was funny because our assumption was as long as we don't get caught in the act, we're good. Let them suspect us, but let's just not get caught in the act. Mm-hmm. So this farmer in Sheboygan, Wisconsin chases us. She called the police, and we got surrounded by cops near the largest fur farm in the country. And they asked us if they could search our car, and we said no. And they were on the phone trying to get, from the DA, trying to get the authority to like impound our car. So they impounded our vehicle when we wouldn't give them consent to search. They applied for a search warrant, and which was eventually granted. So we weren't arrested. We were just dumped off in Sheboygan. And they said, hey, just come back to the police station tomorrow to check on the status of your vehicle. Well, we knew that if they got a search warrant, they would have enough evidence to implicate us in all these fur farm raids, because very foolishly, we were not naive about how proper security should work, but we were just broke. So we couldn't replace the tools fast enough. So we had thrown away our tools at various points, but we still had tools in our car that would link us to most, if not all, of the farms. And so, we'd vacuum the car. We probably didn't do a good job. We just realized there was probably a lot of evidence that linked us to all these fur farms. So they impounded our vehicle, and they got a warrant to search our vehicle. So at that point, when they dropped us off in Sheboygan, they said, come back and get your car in 24 hours. We just went on the run at that point because we knew getting indicted was imminent. So anyway, there's a whole lot I could talk about that, but that was, so we became fugitives. My co-defendant was a fugitive for 2 years. I was a fugitive for 7.5, 8 years.
Yeah. So you mentioned that one fur farm that was raided by someone else. Would you ultimately get convicted of that fur farm raid, or was that not part of it?
No, that wasn't part of it. And just to give you an example of illustrate how active the ALF fur farm campaign was at that point, not only did a farm get raided within a night or two of us supposed to be there, there were also, on the other end of that campaign, there was a farm raided in Illinois. Like, I think it was like a day. Like, if we had driven from Oostburg or Sheboygan, Wisconsin to Illinois, it would have been like the night that we would have been in Illinois. Another farm got raided in Illinois. So this stuff was just happening. Again, the people that did the farm in Idaho are not the people that did Illinois farm. So there were like at least 3 cells out surveilling farms at the same time. And I think maybe even more, because eventually when the paperwork came out in my legal case, they found out there were strong evidence. There was at least 2 other cells surveilling farms just in the Midwest. Forget Idaho. So there was just people out all over the country at that point doing what we were doing. So
I wonder if
we never got charged with that.
I'm sure it never happened, but I'm wondering how funny it would be to like show up at one and just see like other ALF people like,
You
oh,
know what?
ALF, you know?
I'm not gonna dox anyone here or give away names here, but I have a friend who had friends who I did not think they were very credible people, but they claimed that's how they met. They claimed they were both on a fur farm in the middle of the night. And I was like, that is the fakest story on earth. That should be your biggest red flag right there. I was trying to convince my friend not to be friends with this person or these people. But that's that. So maybe it's true. Maybe that actually happened.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of doubt it. Yeah, it just seems like so unlikely. But like you said,
Yeah.
if they were happening all the time, you had this like double life, I guess, for a long time where you were on the run. You mentioned your girlfriend is the one who told you that your co-defendant had turned on you, snitched on you. Uh, and I think at some point, like you were having relationships with people who probably didn't know who you were. I assume like that you didn't have that you had this background in animal rights as well. So yeah, like this reminds me of the movie Catch Me If You Can. Like your story just sounds like fascinating. This life on the run.
I love
Uh,
that book.
yeah, what was this like for you? Like, I mean, I know that's a broad question, but it just sounds wild. Like it's hard for me to even imagine the amount of like adventure
Yeah.
that is.
I did. Yeah. I mean, like you said, I had relationships with people who didn't know I was a fugitive. It's funny. There's a book right over here, off camera, but there was this author who did a book about, it's called Duped, but she did a book about deception in the context of relationships. And so she sought me out to interview me for this book because she had heard that I was engaged in relationships with people and I lied about who I was. So she was looking for this big gotcha. And so she actually interviews one of my ex-girlfriends during the time that I was a fugitive, thinking this was going to be a big, like, oh, I can't believe he lied to me. And she's like, I completely understand why he had to do that. So
Yeah.
it was something I had to do to survive. The thing about lying is you always keep it as close to the truth as you can. So I had like a whole backstory. I knew my backstory really well. And I was very upfront about being, vegan and being very passionate about the subject of animal liberation, but I couldn't reveal the whole story, obviously. So that part of my identity, I didn't conceal. But anyway, going back to the beginning, what was interesting was I think people would think that being a fugitive would be you just go underground, you're basically living this isolated existence, and then you reemerge, you resurface when you got arrested. And it really was not like that for me at all. I was very fortunate that I had a few contacts, just from my years doing activism before I was a fugitive. I had contacts with people. So when I went on the run, I had to leave Seattle, of course, but I would periodically just pop up in towns where I knew people that I could trust, and I would reconnect with them, and they would say, okay, hey, so if you're going this direction, make sure you contact this person. I would get referred to people that were sort of vetted, not vetted like these people are ALF activists, but just these people are tested, they're solid, they are trustworthy people, and you can trust them. And so I was almost like I was getting kind of passed around to like the highest quality people in the movement. So I proceeded to sort of strangely be almost more well networked than I otherwise would have been, because I was meeting kind of the most, the most credible people around the country. So I was actually strangely more involved and more in touch with things than I otherwise would have been. So I got to meet a lot of people, and again, those names will not be named, but tremendous respect to all of them, because all of them, every single person that I interacted with or who knew who I was, and there was a lot of them during the years I was a fugitive, knew that I had a $100,000 price tag on my head. The Fur Commission USA had a $100,000 reward for anyone that would provide information that led to the arrest of me or anyone like me. And so there were dozens of people for whom there was $100,000 waiting for them if they turned me in, and not a single person did. So
yeah,
that's a real testament to the kind of people I was around, and I'm really grateful for that. So with that said, I did not live a very isolated existence, and not only that, I developed a whole parallel group of friends in social world, that people that were almost entirely vegans that didn't know who I was. And they were like people from the punk rock scene. We weren't active. And so really all I had to do was just not not show up at protests and not show up at meetings or like put myself out there too much in the grassroots world. I still did to a large extent. I was still actually around a fair number of people who didn't know who I was, who were actually grassroots activists, but I couldn't get too involved. I didn't want to be like photographed or whatever. So I had to kind of ride that line, but it got strangely public. I mean, there was without doxing myself too much, I was involved in artistic pursuits that got a little bit of a following under a fake name that had me going on tour, putting myself out in front of large numbers of people, all while I was a fugitive. And
amazing.
It was very, very bizarre to have to try to juggle that world. And there were definitely some close calls along the way. But yeah, like I said, I had relationships with people who didn't know who I was. It was interesting.
That must have been tough too, because I'm sure like a lot of people, even though you were secretive about one part of their life, I'm sure that people could identify that Peter is solid. And I'm sure like all these activists who are doing this stuff wanted you to come to all these things. They were like, yeah, come out, Peter. You'll love this event we've got. And you had to keep breaking their hearts.
It was, I got to tell you, it was so painful because I looked like the biggest fraud on earth because I was always ducking out right when it came time to actually do activism. And it really pains me to think about this. I remember like my girlfriend at the time when we first met, whatever. One of my girlfriends was a fugitive. When we first met, she was not vegan. She became vegan. And then just through talking to me, she decided she really wanted to get involved in activism.
Nice.
And I was like, I've created this monster, like the best kind of monster, but like, so I look like the biggest fake to her and I'm fortunate that she later found out why, but like, she was always trying to get me to like, let's go do this, do that. And I'm like, yeah, I can't really do, it was painful.
Did you ever, you had these people who were recommended to you as solid. I assume they knew what was going on, but did you ever like break that unspoken rule for yourself of like sharing with someone like your past life that you feel like maybe I shouldn't have said that?
Yeah. You know what's funny? I've never told this story and it's actually really embarrassing. I did that one time. No, 2 times. There was 2 times. One I feel fine about because I got really close to somebody who was really involved and who knew of my story, but didn't have a face to put to it. And so that kind of made sense. Although really I still shouldn't have done that. But there was one guy, I don't know what I was thinking. I was like, it's embarrassing, but there was a guy who, I was at a BART stop, like the public transit in the Bay Area. And I was wearing a shirt for this band Vegan Reich. This is while I was a fugitive. And this guy comes up to me. He's like, hey man, blah, 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 blah. He's like, I love the band. Blah, blah, blah. Like you should get involved. Like he was just starting talking about activism. And I was like, I'm never going to see this guy again. And I'm about to leave to go to the East Coast. So like, it doesn't even matter. I was like, and I just told him, I was like, hey, it's kind of crazy, but like, do you hear about the kid that got indicted? Like, that's me. It's like so stupid. I don't know if I need to get off my chest that particular day. I don't know what, but without going into the whole story, later that guy became my roommate.
Whoa.
Random as heck. And he ended up being like one of the best people. Like I couldn't have confessed to a more solid person. But wow. So I did. That did happen twice.
I wonder, was it something about him, do you think? Was it something that you just like, you could sense like a solidarity with that guy?
I don't think
he walked
so.
Up to you. No?
I think there's no excuse for it. I think I just was like I think I was probably just feeling completely forgotten about that particular month or something. I don't know.
Yeah, which probably is another aspect of this that people wouldn't realize. Like there's got to be this loneliness aspect of it, or this feeling like, well, I can't talk about, such a major part of me. You express the pain of like feeling like a fraud or looking like a fraud with certain people. I have a question. I'm wondering, because you are straight edge, I believe, right? So
yeah,
no drinking, no drugs. And I'm thinking for your ability to stay, underground as a fugitive for 7 years, probably had a lot to do with your discipline on that, because I feel like a lot of people might get themselves drunk or get themselves high or something. And then that's the moment when they, have like this moment where they want to share about themselves or they let slip. So do you think that probably played some role?
I would imagine so. I think I would, I would still be straight edge regardless of whether I needed that to, remain free as a fugitive. But yeah, I don't doubt that was, but that's just a case of activism in general. If you're doing anything, I mean, I certainly don't think it helps activism, wherever you are on the spectrum of activism, particularly with illegal underground action. You cannot be making missteps. So just the fact that, I didn't drink or do drugs, I think gave me the presence of mind to, I mean, I say this, I'm the one that gets caught, right? So, but the presence of mind to like not slip up more than I did, we'll say.
Well, I mean, you stayed on the run for 7 years, which is kind of amazing. Like, just an incredible story. You mentioned the slip ups, getting caught with stuff in your vehicle. You said that might have had to do with you guys being broke and that sort of thing. I think I heard you say this in maybe the interview the other day with Trey and Jerry, where you mentioned they should have just run my tire tracks, right? So you were just pulling up to fur farms and parking right near there. And I always in my head, I'm like, why, Peter, why didn't you just park a mile away and walk? I mean, I guess there's a practical reason for that, but what would you say to that?
Yeah, and maybe not the smartest thing. I wouldn't say anything in my defense there. But it is interesting when you look at these legal cases, and it's not just legal cases for people who've been caught, but also when you look at things people have never been caught for, or things that were crimes that were never prosecuted. It's very interesting to look at what the things they don't do in their investigations. And I mean, it's been a lot of years now, so I can just say there's things I've done where I think I cannot believe I didn't get caught for that. All they had to do was this one simple investigative thing they just failed to do. And so there's a lot of that. And occasionally they will impress you with their investigative prowess, but most of the time it goes the other way, where you just think, why didn't they just do this one thing that would have been really easy to do and people would have been arrested? So in the case you're referencing, I mean, I talked about how we would just pull up to these farms. We're leaving tire impressions everywhere we go, and they never took the tire. They never looked for tire impressions in the mud. It would have been a really simple thing to do. They never did it. And there's a lot of examples of that where I just think, wow, all you had to do is that you just had to do the bare minimum, and you couldn't even do that. So,
yeah. And in that talk, you mentioned that in your view, that means that they may not be as interested in this as we thought, or as we're sort of fear-mongered to believe that this may not be their top priority, even though the Senate and Congress at one point held hearings and try to paint, animal rights activists as terrorists. They know, let's just be real. They will call us terrorists, right? Because it's good for, industry, but they know that animal rights people are not terrorists. They know that the real terrorists are the Osama bin Ladens or whatever. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting, and maybe a reason for people to feel a little bit less fear.
I think so. I think, you said you referenced fear mongering. I don't think we're the victims of fear mongering. I think activists do it to ourselves.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm not a fan at all of all the conversation around the green scare, and they're all coming for us, and they're gonna put a bag over our head and drag us off to Guantanamo, and this kind of, even though no one ever says that explicitly, that's kind of the implied concern that we're all supposed to have as activists. And I just think it's mostly what we do to ourselves, and it's a conversation that serves no one. In other words, are they calling us terrorists? I don't know. Maybe they are. Why do I care? The ALF is permissionless. That's the whole point. Why do I care what the government is calling me? I care in the legal sense if I get caught. But if you actually look what people get charged with, they get charged with, people that set fires get charged with arson. That's always been a crime. People that they get charged with things that people have always been charged with. So it's do I care if the FBI considers me a terrorist? No. Why would I care? Lots of people say lots of things. I'm not interested in anyone's opinion about me. That's the whole point of working outside of the law, is you don't need to get permission. So I remember when after 9/11, I met up with a friend of mine who has some, experience in this realm. And I remember he said to me, interesting seeing the word terrorism applied to people that aren't us, right? And I said, yeah. He's like, what do you think about that? And I said, I don't know it's interesting, moving on. He's like, yeah, moving on. There was no conversation amongst the ALF about, are they calling us terrorists? I mean, the whole point is you just manage the risk that you can, you do what you can to not get caught. and you're not in this opinion-based ledger of whose side am I on today? We don't care. ALF doesn't care. Nobody should care. So this whole conversation about does the FBI consider us terrorists or not only matters in the courtroom. I don't care outside of that. I don't care what they call us. I know the game I'm playing. The game is it's creating friction. We're agitating. This should be a mystery to nobody, and this should shock nobody when a few people get upset and call you terrorists. So that's my feeling about that.
Yeah. So you had brought up, like, while you were on the run, you had this network of people who are like solid people that you were able to, be introduced with, who didn't turn you in, that sort of thing. That's obviously the counterweight to what you experienced with your co-defendant. And you had mentioned feeling kind of cynical when you talked about that. So, so how do you like square those two things? Because you met all these solid people who, like you said, didn't turn you in, even though, and let's be real, most activists, and this, I don't want to paint everybody with a broad brush, but most activists could use $100,000. They're not wealthy people. So a lot of people were just awesome people. And I'm shocked when I meet people who are animal rights activists, where you don't really get anything from that. I mean, you might get some status amongst vegans or something, but I always like kind of, and I need to be careful of this, I always assume the best of like animal rights people, but you met some of the best, clearly. And they were people who are known, vetted, that sort of thing. But how do you square those two things where you had to deal with somebody who kind of betrayed you with the people who like were really stand-up people?
The real answer is I can't confidently say what any one of those people who turned down 100K would do if they were faced with prison. I mean, can you, I can't, there's very few people where I can say with complete confidence, they would have the same level of fortitude if they were looking at significant prison time. And that's just the real answer.
That's a fair point.
There's a difference between $100,000 and prison time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big difference. Good point. Because, the $100,000 is something that you don't have. Whereas, facing like years, decades in prison, very different thing.
And by the way, I would apply that to myself. I should be put to the same scrutiny. I served a year extra for not informing, and people go, oh, that guy didn't snitch. But, I can say what I think I would do if I was facing 20 years, which is I would not. And I know that inside, but I have not been tested. Right. Like I turned down, I gave up a year of my life to not inform on people. I didn't give up. There was no, you're going to get 20 years. We're going to reduce that to 2 years if you inform. Right. So the point is, you don't really ever find out who someone is until they're actually stress tested.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. I wanted to ask you about that too, because to me, that's so interesting. Like, and that, I guess it's not that different. Like, obviously there were above ground aspects of what you were doing, but this is back, I assume this was before like Facebook and all those things. And the government was offering to lessen your charge. I mean, lessen your offense by like a punishment by a year, by just naming some names, where I feel like nowadays, like they can just go on our Facebook and see who all our friends are. Now that doesn't necessarily tell people who's hanging out with who's where, when, but that sort of thing. But what do you think about like social media? Do you think like we're way too open, or do you think like it's a strength? Do you think it's a strength or a weakness?
Oh, it's absolutely a weakness, 100%. And I think we forget what the world was like before someone's entire network was just, laid bare to every law enforcement agency. I mean, when I got arrested, it was very difficult to figure out who, and I mean, actually social media is the lesser concern. Cell phones are the bigger one. There was no, now you've got a single device that is a common denominator amongst every single person you interact with. That didn't exist before. And so I didn't have a cell phone when I was on the run. So they had a very difficult time figuring out who I associated with. And that would almost be impossible now.
Right.
I don't want to say impossible. It is with enough effort, you can sort of create a parallel life for yourself without a digital footprint. But it is a challenge.
Yeah. Well, so, since so much of what you talk about is try to dispel the fear, like what if someone like listens to that and then they think, oh, so it was something that Peter could do back in the day, but how could I do this today? Because nowadays there's cell phones, there's Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff that everybody's on. What would you say to that?
I would say leave your phone at home if you're going to do something illegal. I would say park far away because there's certainly more cameras now. Wear a mask. It's not that hard. I think it's probably 25% harder, but it's not impossibly hard.
Right. Not impossibly hard. Yeah. So, you know, I asked this to Tom Harris, who was a member of the Shot campaign in the UK and did about the same length of time in prison with you. I asked him, what was it like for you while you were in prison? Because having, as someone who hasn't done prison time, I thought like one of the things that would really bother me about doing that time is to be taken out of the fight, so to speak. So when you were in prison, did you feel like there were ways that you could be useful to the movement still, or did you feel taken out of it?
I felt taken out of it. I didn't feel, I think there was some idea early on where maybe I can have this kind of spokesperson role that might, you know, be able to kind of leverage what I have, which is whether I'm in prison or the immediate wake of prison, you know, this, I don't know, this like martyr idea, whatever, and somehow leverage that to have an impact. I think so actually being in prison, I accept it. I'm out of the fight. I mean, there is not a lot I can do. I can write a statement here and there. Realistically, it's going to be read and people are going to move on to the next thing. And it's just not going to have much of an impact. So I tried to do what I could. But I was mostly preparing for getting out. And so when I got out, I had this idea that it's like, what am I going to do? How could I be the most impactful I can be? Well, I could start my own organization. What would that look like? Well, I'm not, I guess I have leadership qualities when it comes to like a small group. I'm not like really a team player on a bigger scale. So I don't know if that doesn't really play to my strengths to start like some large organization. You know, it's kind of hard to go backwards just to waving a sign. Like I still do that, but I don't consider that to be kind of a role I want to step into completely. So I was just trying to figure out like, what's my role? And it made sense that maybe if I asked myself the question, kind of like we're talking about with my book, Liberate, which is what did I need to hear when I was 18? Maybe I can be that resource to the 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds now. And maybe I can figure out what people need to hear and like what's that combination on the lock that will turn people into super warriors. And so maybe I can be that kind of spokesperson and be that spark for certain people. And so that would take the form of like speaking in colleges and things like that and kind of being the ALF. So I kind of stepped into that role and I realized very quickly that the people who are going to do these actions, you're going to be a part of the ALF, they're going to do it no matter what. Like you can't hold them back from it. All you can do is give them access to the information they need, but you're never going to turn a room of 1,000 vegans into 500 ALF activists. And I kind of had this like idea that I've since revised my opinion on, which is that people just need to hear the right things and then they'll be motivated to take risks and take action. And I just realized the average person is too risk averse and it's just simply never going to happen. It's not to call into question their sincerity at all. It's just simply most people are just not wired for it. And they don't have the risk tolerance. They don't have the personality type just isn't there. And so, but again, coming out of prison, I thought, you put me in full of room of 1,000 people, I'm going to figure out how to turn. And by the way, if there was a lawyer in the room right now, they would be jumping on top of me with duct tape to cover my mouth. But like, what do I need to say to turn a room of 1,000 people into 1,000 ALF activists? And I thought there was a combination. There's a lock and there's a combination of that lock. And I realized that's just not, eventually I realized that's not really how it works. But that was kind of my idea at the time. And, I would, and so for me, that was specific tactical advice, like how to pick locks. Like I can't really give a speech on here's how to pick locks in front of like, at Harvard or whatever, but like I can kind of pepper a lecture with certain how-to information. It was dispelling myths about prison. That was a big obstacle for people. For me personally, it was, and it was also how to overcome fear. And so I think those are like kind of like the three big beats I wanted to hit when I addressed an audience of activists or had any kind of platform at all. And I don't think that was very effective, but I tried.
Well, I mean, it's effective, at least with some people. Like, I was going to say like, it's almost like of all the people that got caught, I'm almost grateful it's you, no offense, because you are so well spoken, and it's great to have someone who's really good at communicating this to people, as someone who can talk about it, since the people who haven't been caught really can't talk about it, or probably or shouldn't talk about it. And that kind of brings me to a question. You just kind of alluded to it right here. This is like a tricky subject to navigate. As you said, like, oh, a lawyer would be telling me, don't say this, don't say this. You know, I'm someone who like has this interest in the history of the movement. I have an interest in seeing animals saved. I haven't taken a position as to, you know, whether or not I, you know, support one form of activism over another, but it's just a tricky thing to talk about. And how do you navigate? Are you just sort of like, you know, at this point, look, I've done my time, I'm just talking about what other people do. So do you just feel sort of free to talk about it? Or do you feel those constraints at times when you're like, well, I don't know if I can say this, I don't know if I can say that?
The constraints aren't, so yes, I do feel like there's constraints, but I wouldn't say they're legal. I don't think so whatever I might censor myself or hold myself back from telling stories or whatever, I don't think it's as much legal, because so much time has passed. It would be so difficult to prosecute anything at this point. But I think for me, part of it is I'm going to write a book, and that's going to be I don't want to give any spoilers, but also I do think there's something to be said for maintaining the kind of integrity of the ALF, where it's good if there's no social incentive to do these things. In other words, if you do something and you're never going to be able to talk about it, and, assume you don't get caught, and you're never going to be able, it just happened, and it happened because you felt it needed to happen, and because it was a just and necessary thing to do. I like the idea that everyone just doesn't talk about what they've done, even if there's no legal consequences at this point. And, it's like, I can tell a story, it's like whatever, chickens or whatever, there's stuff that I think it's just necessary to have some stories to tell. Right. But I think whatever constraints I put on myself would just simply be why let's just leave it for what it was. It was something that needed to happen, and it hopefully the world's better off for it.
What do you think about like a counter argument to that? Like, I worked a lot with Wayne Hsiung, and Wayne was someone who like kind of preached to us, like, the whole idea of these open rescues is they're a compelling story, and so important to be able to tell the public a good story. And that could be what changes the world. I think it's his, part of his theory of change. Yeah. So what do you think about that? Do you like, in terms of, and it's interesting, I'm glad you said are you writing another book? Is that what you said?
I've been saying this for years, but I mean, I don't know if it's one book or 3 books. That's my only challenge.
Oh, okay. I'm excited. But yeah, that's where was I going with that? Yeah. What do you think? Like, I mean, I do think that, like you said, you mentioned, when you were a young guy and you were hearing these bands talk about it, there was something very compelling that drew you to that. And part of it was, the image, the idea, and it could also be the story. So what about that? Or are you just saying, like, basically, like, if someone's out doing those things, and they should feel comfortable that they don't talk about it, but like someone like you who has been caught and can talk about it? I don't know where I'm going. I'm not wording this question well, but rescue me, Peter. Take it away, like with what I've said.
I think it's, I haven't really fully fleshed this out, like in a way I can articulate, but I feel like it pollutes how pure ALF actions are. You got to figure, there's people in the middle of the night, they're risking their freedom, and it's something that happens and can never be spoken out of again. And that's the understanding you have going into it. And you're not thinking about, well, in 20 years, the statute of limitations will run out, and then maybe I'll be on a podcast one day. You're not thinking about that at all. It's just, it happens. It has to happen. And you're fortunate enough to find a few, 1 or 2 other people to work with. And it happens in a vacuum, and it's never spoken of again. And there's something very pure about that I appreciate. Now, with the open rescue model, totally get it. 100% supportive. I do think stories are how you reel in the public. And I'm really grateful for like Ingrid Newkirk wrote a book called Free the Animals that I read early on in my activist career. That was fantastic. And, there's no point in Free the Animals where the author says, I did this thing. It's like there's no point in the book where who did the thing, right? And everyone kind of knows because you can kind of read between the lines. There's lots of clues, but nobody's saying I did the thing or who did the thing. So I like that. We don't need to know. And I think the more, it's like, it comes back to the conversation we had at the very beginning, which is what are the pros and cons of the ALF being perceived as heroes and these mystical, warriors who are these superhumans, and then just the guy next door. There's big pros and cons to each, but I think we should have both. The open rescue model, it puts a face on, whatever. I mean, it's still illegal, illegal actions. Mm-hmm. And then you got the ALF that maybe we could be perceived them as just being something different, if it's completely not how they're not. Again, they're not trained warriors. They're not anything. It's just people like you and I. But there's something to be said for a little bit of mystery. And I think we don't have a lot of mystery left in this world. True. The internet has eliminated mystery. You can now see a Google Street View of every random street corner in the entire country. You used to have to drive 2,000 miles to get there. There is no mystery anymore. And I like the idea of mystery.
I have a friend who also did time for the same reason. And they expressed that one of the reasons why they did it was like cynicism, actually. And I wondered, because it was almost like, okay, I can't save all the animals, but I can save these animals. And that sort of gets to the heart of in my questioning, do you think this is effective in terms of beyond saving those animals? Do you think the ALF actions have been effective towards freeing all the animals? And I know that's impossible to say, but in the long run, do you think it gets us closer when you've saved, for instance, if it's the 8,000 mink and foxes that you've saved, does that get us closer to the goal or not?
I think it does, but I don't think it has to. I think these actions have merit whether they do or not. Now, it just so happens, I mean, I can tell you the math I was always doing was, how many animals am I going to save tonight? It's not, am I going to shut this farm down? That wasn't even a thought. It happened to be a happy side effect that certainly happened multiple times, but that really wasn't a thought. It was just, how many animals am I going to get out of these cages? And so that, the good thing is you don't have to choose, right? So you could carry out an illegal action, underground action for animals, and you could just say, you know what, this is not going to move us towards animal liberation any faster outside of just these animals that I'm saving. And then you could wake up the next morning and be involved in white coat waste to shut down labs that will have a long-term impact. And you can do both. You don't have to choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. That's a great answer, by the way. Yeah, I remember this part in your book. I think I'm remembering this correctly. There was a photo of you standing in front of a liberated mink farm years later, just staring out at it. It had been shuttered, I think, and I feel like you described seeing a mink run off in the distance. That must have been quite a moment. And when was that for you? Was that one of the moments of your life? Because I assume it would be for me just to see that.
That was the moment. I mean, I've never had a more cinematic moment of my life, to the point where I think I was saying this on the stream I did the other night too, that you watched, which is I almost don't like to tell the story because it sounds completely bogus. like you go back to a farm you raided, and then a mink hops out. But it's there's witnesses. I was there with another person. It was. I remember just sitting there staring and just going, that can't be a mink. And I without even turning to my friend, I said, is that what I think it is? And she just goes, yeah. And we just watched this mink hop across the road. So yeah, incredible. And it's is that a descendant of a mink? I don't know. A mink I released. I don't know. But
what's the lifespan of a mink? I don't even know.
I should know this, and I don't know in the wild. I don't know I know the lifespan on a farm. I don't know the lifespan of a mink in the wild.
Yeah, yeah. I was wondering if, it could have potentially been one that you had rescued or something, but
No,
yeah,
it definitely not. Well,
definitely.
no, because this was 12. I remember specifically it was 12 years later, so I'm pretty confident the lifespan's not 12 years. But this is a
Okay.
farm in Medford, Wisconsin, that was one of the two that shut down after we raided it.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, that's an incredible story. I'm really glad you put that in the book. Obviously, you had to. It was the moment. Yeah, and don't feel embarrassed about it. It doesn't sound made up because like you guys have pointed out, like on the live stream, like once you've rescued the mink, they are, you know, uh wild animals. They can survive out there. So it's very plausible that that would have been a descendant of that mink. So that's amazing. I told you we were going to talk about Nancy Grace. Like I have to ask about that. It was such a funny interview, and I forgot. Like when I learned about you when Jerry loaned me that book like a couple years ago, and I looked up like interviews, I had forgotten Nancy Grace existed. Thankfully, now I know again. But for people who are younger, like Nancy Grace was this like I don't even know why they put her on the air other than she was like kind of like a Karen with a microphone.
mhm.
So tell me about that because I'll definitely link to that interview so that people can watch it. But tell me what that experience was like for you and how that happened.
Nancy Grace. I mean, I've said this before, but it's like every criminal's dream to be mocked by Nancy Grace because she was like this character. I mean, I guess she's still around, but this caricature of an angry, nasty, heartless prosecutor. And she's a former prosecutor. And so she's like this angry Southern woman that just has nothing but contempt for criminals, no matter who they are. And
Yeah.
so what I think was crazy about that interview is they DM'd me on Twitter, which like I'm not hard to find, but I don't know why they would choose Twitter. So the producer DM'd me on Twitter and was like, "Hey, do you want to come on Nancy Grace tomorrow?" And I said, "Okay, sure." And I could be wrong, but I don't even think we talked on the phone. I just remember showing up at the studio being like, "Why are they so confident that I'm even the right person?" Like, I don't have a verified Twitter account. I could be anyone. And so they just DM'd me like, "Hey, we need you last minute." And I was like, "All right, sure." So they were having me on about a fugitive. So there's a woman who's still on the run for a series of her role in a series of arsons. They were Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front arsons. So it's like two different sort of categories.
Mm.
But she was still on the run, and I had these like, I had some hesitation about going on where I don't want to be on a show that's going to try to help catch a fugitive. That would be the ultimate irony, right?
Mm.
So, but ultimately, I decided I'm just going to go on there and try to derail the whole conversation, basically. So yeah, they had me on. They sent a town car to pick me up, and they took me to a local TV station that had some a relationship with them, where they set me up in their studio. And everyone was really nice coming in. Like everyone at the studio, they didn't know who I was. They just knew I was going to be on Nancy Grace. So they're giving me like, "Oh, Nancy Grace guest," and they think I'm this lawyer or something. And then once I start talking, they're like, and when I left, they were like, wouldn't even speak to me. They're like, "Get out of here." But yeah, it was funny. So they had me on. So the part that got cut out of that interview was we got into a shouting
Oh,
match, which is, I think it's
really?
weird they cut it out because it was like good TV, I would think. But we got into a shouting match over the merits of setting a fire when knowing that first responders could be potentially harmed. And my position was, don't put out a fire at a slaughterhouse.
Mm. Mm.
Or I don't know what I said, but we got in a big shouting match about it, and they cut that part out.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I'll link to it so people should just watch it, but I think it's funny that she was like, Peter, I sympathize with your cause about the animals, but I do not approve of setting fires, which by the way, you hadn't done. It was like she was having
Yeah.
you speak for some other action. And that was just awesome television. Yeah,
I
for
still
any
have
animal
people
respect.
that I meet that will like Google me and they'll be like, "So you set fire?" Like they confuse that interview with me having set fires because they don't
Right,
give a lot of context as to who I am. So she
right.
didn't give a lot of context to who I was. But the best
Yeah.
part was when she goes, "Peter, you are a politically motivated criminal." Or no, she's like, "You're an activist and da 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 da, aka a criminal."
Yeah,
And just like lets it
that
hang there.
was
I was like,
awesome.
"That's golden."
Yeah, yeah, you looked kind of happy. I could see it on your face. You were just like, yes.
I'll take it.
Yeah. Well, I always ask this of my guests, like just like what books they recommend, which is interesting because in Liberate, you recommend books, and it's interesting, like you recommend to animal rights activists to read books outside the animal liberation sphere, so to speak. So, yeah, let me just pose that same question to you, though, and I'll also throw this back up on the screen because I feel like everybody should read your books, and that it being one of them right there. This is a big one, by the way, of the collected works right here. But personally, I recommend people to read Liberate, of course, because that was the one that really hit me. But yeah, what would you recommend for people reading? And what do you read these days?
So a couple categories of books I'd recommend. One, I would recommend reading about people who have sacrificed more for less than what we're fighting for. So that could be, there's a book, is it Jerry Adams? I'm trying to remember it's on my shelf right here somewhere. From like IRA related person, like what some of the IRA, like what they've sacrificed. Read books about people who have given up more, than you and I ever will, for something that, is I think most of us would agree is they're fighting for, not to give a hierarchy to oppression or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But like, there's the victims that we're trying to save outnumber the victims of some of these other number of other struggles we're trying to save. So people that made sacrifices, to put things in perspective, I would recommend people read books about specifically if you want to carry out illegal underground action, books written by and about criminals who people are motivated by money, which sounds strange, but if you want to know how to break into a lab, you've got to read books by and about burglars. And there are books out there that will teach you how to literally burglarize buildings. There's one called Burglary in the City. Am I butchering that? I'm looking over at my bookshelf behind the camera here. Burglary in the City, I think. I can't, but it's one of the best books. But he talks about just different case studies of burglaries. How people have physically penetrated physical barriers to break into buildings. Read books about heists. Understand how much creativity and ingenuity people are applying to the pursuit of money, and ask ourselves why we aren't applying the same level of ingenuity to animal liberation. So there's a whole list of books. Yeah. And my book, Liberate, I talk about, I give some examples. And so I guess those would be two categories of book. Like you referenced Catch Me If You Can. That was a movie that people know. The book is actually much better. And that's a fantastic book that, will instruct you on how to think creatively about how to circumvent obstacles, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So
was that an autobiography?
It was, written by
okay.
Whatever his name is. Yeah,
the guy. Yeah. Well, I'm asking this a little out of order, and but I was going to ask you, do you have any regrets? Like when you look back at your life, like I really feel like you've done amazing stuff writing these books, being a spokesperson. But I'm sure there are things you would do differently, but what are some of those things? And like, do you have major regrets, or are you like kind of happy with where you're at?
I can die saying I've done most of what I said I was going to do. And I think that's just about the most that, anyone could hope for, whether that's, activism wise and political, business or personal, whatever. So certainly I feel pretty good about things. I think if I was going to go back, I didn't understand at the time how rare it is to have like a group of people all on the same page, all focused on a single goal, all willing to risk themselves. To get 4 or 5 or 6 of those people in your life at the exact same time, like that will probably never happen again. And if you are so fortunate as to be in that situation, capitalize on it immediately and in the biggest way possible, in the biggest way you're comfortable with. The mistake that I made is I had a group, and it wasn't just my code. I mean, I had a bunch of people that were in my life at one time. All of us, like I said, we're on the same page. We're all willing to take risks. And I thought, oh, I've got my friends and we're going all the way to the grave. And so I've got 40 years to figure this stuff out. I got 40 years of activism ahead of me with this group of people. That was 19-year-old brain. And I realize now, when you have those people are not going to be around forever, and you might only have them for 6 months. And take bold action quickly when you have people willing, on the same page, on the same trajectory, willing to take risks, when you're people you're completely aligned with, capitalize on that immediately and in the biggest way possible. So I wish I hadn't spent a lot of time doing the training wheels style activism. Like, okay, well, let's go test out how we work together by breaking out windows at McDonald's. And then we'll go to the meat distributors. Then we'll go to the slaughterhouse. And then we'll work our way up to bigger and bigger actions. I wish we'd gone right for the big actions. And I would have saved myself a lot of time. And honestly, not really exposed myself to that much more risk. I think it's probably riskier. If you're careful, it's riskier to break the windows at McDonald's than it is to, say, break into a lab. Because you can manage your risk when it comes to breaking into a building in a way that, you know, maybe you can't do when you're doing something really loud in the middle of a populated environment. So I wish I'd really seized that opportunity more than I did. I seized it, you know, and to a degree I can be really comfortable with, but I think I could have done a lot more. So that would be a big one.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for, you know, coming on the podcast, also writing the books, and of course for what you've done for animals. Like, it's just amazing. Like, I'm really glad that there are people like you in the movement who we can look up to and kind of learn from right now. I'm sure you get this. You probably get this like too much. It's probably cringy to you, but it's just you led such a giant life. Like, not that it's over, but I just really appreciate that, and it's such an honor to meet you. It really is.
I appreciate that very much.
And let me know, like, we were talking about social media and stuff. I usually link to people's socials, like, but how do you want people to find you, or how can they find you if you want them to in those types of ways? Like, where can people see?
I'm pretty easy to find on Facebook. If you can't find me on Facebook, you can email me at peter@peteryoung.me. It's just a little like business card style website, but that email address will get to me. peter@peteryoung.me. And that's, no Instagram. No, I don't have a lot of it, but yeah, Facebook, I'm easy to find.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, Peter, I'll let you go. You've been such a great guest. I appreciate you, and you're always welcome back on this program. It's small, but you know, you can always come on here anytime. Invite yourself and I'll invite you back.
Thank you, man. I appreciate your work.
All right. Take care.